This week on Enterprise Security Weekly, we've got a new host to introduce. Very exciting. Also in the Enterprise Security news, two data security companies are merging. Vericode's products are now available in the AWS marketplace. Zscaler launches a program for organizations dealing with the SolarWinds attack. You might have heard of that. SolarWinds is also being sued in a class action lawsuit. Funding announcements from Weaveworks, iBoss, and Venafi. Chris Brown, Senior Director of Security at Imperva, joins us to discuss the state of data security. Sean Metcalf, founder and CTO at Trimarc Security, and Tyler Robinson, Security Weekly host, as many of you know, and also the Offensive Security Director at Trimarc Security. They'll come on and discuss, well, the SolarWinds attack and hopefully how to defend against it. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. CyberArray for Teams was built to help organizations stay ahead of today's evolving threat landscape and to meet today's most difficult security challenges. Fortune 500 companies like Amgen, Booz Allen Hamilton, Plexus, CVP, Fannie Mae, and Vizio, small businesses worldwide, and several branches of the U.S. military use CyberArray for Teams to close the skill gaps that put their organizations at risk and to equip their workforce with the skills to defeat their security adversaries. CyberArray for Teams. Problem solved. Visit cyberarray.it/solved to solve your training problems. Face it, your data is everywhere. No matter where your data lives or what tools you use, Imperva Data Security unifies compliance, security, and privacy needs for any data store while saving you time and money. Imperva finds threats before they become a compliance or security incident, and built-in automation empowers you to remediate quickly. Give your business confidence about what is happening with your data, where it's stored, and who's accessing it. For a 30-day free trial of cloud data security, visit securityweekly.com/Imperva. Can we continue to function without facts? Cybercriminals exploit the absence of facts, harming organizations through the easiest point of entry, email. No company should claim they can stop all phishing attacks. It's about having all the facts in seconds and reducing the time it takes to respond. It's minutes versus hours in the difference between a security incident and a breach. Great Horn. See through the dark. To learn more, go to securityweekly.com/Greathorn. Detecting and responding to threats in the cloud is harder than doing it on-prem. Even when you do have the visibility you need, legacy security workflows weren't designed for the speed and complexity of cloud environments. Cloud-native security solutions from ExtraHop are purpose-built to spot threats across the hybrid attack surface, provide detailed investigation steps, and help you automate response. Request your 30-day free trial at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly, episode number 212 for January 6th, 2021. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Adrian Sanabria. Adrian, welcome.
Hey, thanks. It's good to be back. I've been looking forward to this.
I like the blue lights. It's good stuff. Good stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
Also, I'm happy to announce the latest addition to the Enterprise Security Weekly host lineup, Mr. Tyler Shields. Tyler advises, guides, and operates high-tech startups, primarily in the B2B space. He's a former market analyst, engineer, product manager, market leader, and partnership manager. And I still feel like that doesn't do it justice. Tyler, welcome to the show.
That is way too long an introduction. Thanks, Paul.
You do have you're one of the veterans like us that have been in security 20 plus years or so, right?
Yeah, they call us boomers.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. Outstanding.
Ouch.
Well, it's nice to have you as a regular host. I'm super excited to have you join us. So,
thanks, bud. Looking forward to spending the weekly time with you.
Absolutely. It's just kind of funny. A lot of our friends the time we get to spend together is the time on the shows, right? Because we're all so busy. So, bring your friends in to do podcasts. That's been my goal for 15 years, right?
Sign me up.
Stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe. Subscribe to all your favorite podcasts on the Security Weekly network. There's lots of them. You can get our YouTube channel, our mailing list, and join our Discord server. So make sure you do that at securityweekly.com/subscribe. Also, if you have guest suggestions for the shows, make sure you go to securityweekly.com/guest. There's a form you can fill out, and we will review those on a regular basis. Alrighty. We've got some news to talk about this week. Kind of light. It's really weird. The end of the year, beginning of the year are very light on product announcements. I think there's only 2 or 3 in here. And one is, Vericode's like, our entire product suite is available in the AWS marketplace. I don't know how much we could dig into that necessarily. Yeah. The marketplace is what it is, right?
But the funding continues to flow.
Mm-hmm. Which is good.
No COVID, political snafus, nothing is going to stop the funding.
I think the money is easy.
Right? Weaveworks is a Series C at $36 million. I thought we covered this late last year. It was kind of weird. Some of the funding announcements that I was looking at late last year, they kind of resent out the press releases, I think, because of the break. So we may have covered this already.
Maybe, Tyler, you're a bit more savvy with this stuff, but I'm failing. I think there's some subtlety in, how Kubernetes is supported here. I see a lot of these stories about these companies that are, almost replaced by AWS, but they say it's complementary, and you're kind of like, okay, yeah, we'll see in a couple years.
Yeah, I'm just amazed at the valuation that companies are getting nowadays, right? And I think the key thing in that particular piece, honestly, was the GitOps mention. I don't know if you guys caught that, but it's a term I've been using a lot over the last year, really focusing on embedding how things work right into Git, because that's the context that developers live in. So I think anything that's doing Git, Kubernetes Cloud is just getting significant funding right now, over-funded.
Yeah, you're right, because there are 2 of the common denominators now in the enterprise software space for sure, right?
Yeah, the closer you can get to the developer, the more value you can get.
And that's really just another term for CI/CD, is it not?
Yeah, but it's CI/CD in the cloud, if you ask me, right? It's taking the CI/CD concept and injecting it into the operational context of the developer instead of the operations team, letting the developer really get a hold of it. That's why I like GitOps. Right. I think it's a cool idea.
Okay. Yeah, because at the end of the day, a developer's going to basically check in some code. That's kind of an antiquated term, right? We call it pull requests in Git because Linus developed it. In any case, that's a whole other segment. And so that's really where you want to start kicking off your actions, right? I want to develop the code, and when I push it up into the repository, I want things to happen, right? I don't want to worry about it as a developer. I just want to know, one, my code's not on my workstation anymore. It's somewhere safe that can be backed up, and things are happening. It's getting tested, it's getting analyzed, it's going through the pipeline.
Right, and everything basically is left of build. Everything left of build is going to be in Git.
Yep.
Right. And to your point, Tyler, 36 million is not an eyebrow raiser as a Series C, but for what they're doing, yeah, I agree. That's a pretty big raise for that kind of product.
Yeah, especially so early.
But yeah, I remember seeing Palo Alto acquired Expanse. I wouldn't have thought I'd see an 800 million acquisition in attack surface monitoring, for example.
Yeah, when money's easy, valuations soar.
Just to segue on that a bit, I'm still very excited about the attack surface management space. I don't know. I guess I kind of know why, but I feel like it should be bigger than it really is, because I feel like it's something that everyone should be doing.
It's important, sure.
Right? You should just be doing it.
Yeah. I'm gonna do a group test on that market. That's definitely going to be in the works for the next year.
I think because it's basic blocking and tackling, largely, 80% of it is make sure, what information can people glean from my SSL certs, where are my domains, my IP space, my web presence. But that kind of stuff, it gets away from people, from large organizations, and ends up being included in attacks. And one of my favorite examples that I keep coming back to is the email phishing attack that targeted executives that we dug into last year. And one of the things in the attack was the Apache servers at large companies such as Sony and others were open to redirects. And I'm like, basically that's attack surface management, like from the outside looking in. And it's stuff that people don't pay attention to. The ironic part is, from a risk perspective, they weren't really attacking Sony, right? They were using that to attack other places. So I can see sitting at Sony going, yeah, it's an open redirect, but it's not getting priority because maybe they're not attacking us with it, right? They're attacking someone else. Hey, it's John Strand. What's up, John? Happy New Year.
Hey, I'm still alive, I guess.
Yay.
No, it's good to be on the show. Is Adrian on? Who's all on?
Adrian and Tyler Shields.
I'm here.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic.
What's up, John?
Hey, dude. Hey, how's it going?
Good, man. Good.
Adrian, we got to get together again. You were the last person I had dinner with at a con.
Right. It was the three of us. We were at the noodle place.
Oh, that's right.
We
Adrian
need to
and I
get together at the first.
That's right. It was at the noodle place, and then you took off. You had like meeting after meeting after meeting.
No, then we went to the cigar lounge.
Yep. So, but on this one, you're talking about this redirect, and I wanted to jump in. This is interesting because anytime we find that as a vulnerability, we're like, hey, this is open to a redirect. We always have customers that are like, well, how is someone actually going to exploit that for us? And we talk about, redirect being used to attack another company. We can use a redirect for a number of different things. And they're like, yeah, but you can't exploit it with Metasploit, so it's not that big of a deal. Right. It's just like everyone has these very tightly defined definitions of what risk is and what they think it looks like, but they don't actually see that until a company comes in and actually wrecks them. And a pen test or an attacker actually uses that vulnerability as well.
Is this a case of it doesn't affect me? Meaning, sure, you use my stuff to attack somebody else, but you're not really hitting me, so who cares?
Yeah. I think it's part of that, but I think a larger part of it is like Dave Attell just posted something to Daily Dave that I thought was very good.
That was one of the greatest Daily Dave posts maybe ever.
It was awesome. And it's that whole CVE thing, right? And when people are talking about CVEs, it's like they have this score number in their head. Well, we're going to fix everything over 6.2. And they don't know that a lot of that is garbage. And whenever you're looking at something like a redirect, it falls in that medium category, where almost everything that falls in the medium category requires that particular condition to exist with another condition in order for it to be exploited. And I think as soon as you get away from point-click exploit and you get to more complicated exploitation schemes, people's heads just fry out. They have no idea how that can actually be used. Even whenever we get to the point where we demonstrate that risk, like an example would be anonymous FTP enabled. Well, if you have anonymous FTP enabled on a web server, I can write to like the temp directory. The web server can read from the temp directory. I can upload a web shell, have the web server read from the temp directory, execute the web shell, and get access to your server. But as soon as you start getting into too many different lines kind of explaining this vulnerability, it gets really hard for people to internalize and understand that risk.
Yep. And it's so specific to every application and every organization. That Daily Dave, we haven't chatted in a while, but maybe we need to bring Dave on the show again because he has a quote.
The last decade of security metrics?
Yeah, like I don't have the email in front of me because of two-factor, but he said in the article, if you took a neural network and you ran all the artwork in the world through it and scored it on a scale of 1 to 10, you would have results that are useless, pretty much like CVSS.
So actually, Scientia Security did some work for Kenna, or Scientia Institute did some work for Kenna Security. Let me get the names right. That basically showed that fixing stuff that's like CVSS 7 and above, you're just as likely to fix the right stuff if you just attack stuff at random.
Yep.
And just ignore the score altogether. That's how bad it is.
Yep.
Yes, I would agree. In fact, in all my classes, I actually have a lab where I run a scan, and there's a whole bunch of vulnerabilities that we exploit at BHIS, like indexable directories, Office file documents on servers, Telnet being enabled. There's a bunch of them, right? And they're all like lows and informationals. And I actually have people look at the actual output from the banner. And if they look closely at it, they're like, holy crap, this is really, this should be a critical. And I think that whole CVE concept, it loses context, right? We strived very hard to get things as objective as we possibly could. And you can't have this objectivity in a scoring system and then have context associated with it. Those two things don't go with each other very well. And that's why I think that anytime anyone's talking about vulnerability management and automated prioritization, they're talking out their ass. It's just garbage, because it's impossible for a tool to actually look at something in terms of the context associated with what that vulnerability or that informational is telling you.
It doesn't take chaining into account. It doesn't take cred stuffing into account.
Yep.
There's just so much missing from that.
Well, and you're talking about like the SolarWinds thing. We have a news story in here where SolarWinds is getting hacked, and they should be getting, or not, sorry, they're getting sued.
Yeah, class action lawsuit.
Should be.
Yeah, they already got hacked.
What's that?
They already got hacked.
Yeah, it's already done. That's done. But SolarWinds 1, 2, 3 actually isn't something that a prioritization scheme in your vulnerability management suite would ever detect, right? It's not going to say, hey, we should totally try this password everywhere. It's just, it requires humans to get involved and look at things in terms of context.
Right. And I think some of my arguments are, if you're not doing some type of vulnerability management to free up the time on your team to address the things that you can't really truly automate, like password spraying and things that require a human, you're in rough shape. I think that there are certain vendors that have gotten much better at helping you take the subjectivity out of vulnerability remediation. I've seen some great tech this past year.
Remediation, for sure.
And they're automated. So Vicarious, full disclosure, I'm an advisor and they're a sponsor, right? But I spent a lot of time with the team, and they can come in and basically give you good information to help automate that and automate the remediation. They've got patchless stuff, which I think is really super interesting. We've done a ton of segments with them on PSW. But what I really like about it is they tell you the stuff that you should take into account to, like Adrian said, not at random, but a little more focused to get you there so that you can focus on the things like, hey, when we've got software from a third party, let's make sure that it doesn't have more access than it needs. That's not a vulnerability management thing. Vulnerability management is going great now because we've done,
that's hygiene.
Taking the step. It's hygiene. It's exactly it. Yep.
So, Paul, do you remember years ago when let's take a step back from this, right? If you look at vulnerability management, years and years ago, like it might be a decade now, when we sat down with Renault at Tenable, there was that reporting plugin that you had created or you found online and you modified it, where it kicked out the reports and it kicked them out by plugin ID or by vulnerability instead of by IP address. And we were using that in all of our pen tests, and it was amazing. So instead of saying, we have 150,000 vulnerabilities, which no one really has that many, instead, what you actually have is a few hundred or maybe a few thousand vulnerabilities that are replicated across multiple different systems. And by showing that report and showing it like this vulnerability exists on 400 systems, it kind of creates that prioritization. It also makes it easier to remediate. It's like, well, we don't have to fix this as a one-off on this system and on this system and on this system. We basically can use Ansible, Puppet, Chef, SCCM, group policy to fix this across these 500 systems in one shot. And we sat down with Renault, and I don't remember who else we talked to at Tenable, but we're like, this is the way that you need to do like reporting of vulnerabilities. And there was a little bit of pushback on that, but Tenable was the first company that actually released that as one of the options to have the vulnerabilities basically listed and grouped by vulnerability and not by IP address. And it's still like not the default option. It's like the exact opposite. It's the bottom of everything.
You got to dig. And one thing that Vicarious is doing that I really like along those lines is they're telling you which applications are used the most and factoring that in, because that matters. Like you said, John, you've got maybe a lot of instances of this software, but also it's being used the most. And tracking that usage, I think, is super important as well, because that speaks to your attack surface.
And you got to flip it the other side too. You got to do fat head and you've got to do long tail.
Yep.
Because a lot of the applications we take over, it's not like their core app. It's this weird thing that's in a closet somewhere that everyone's forgotten about.
Yep. On the SolarWinds front, other than the class action lawsuit, which, I mean, comes as no surprise based on what we know so far, there are some vendors offering solutions and security assessments, based on that. The one that I chose, again, their sponsor, Edgewise was acquired by Zscaler, so full disclosure there. But we've got a deep knowledge of what Edgewise can do. And if I had to pick, all the vendors are going to be like, oh, we can help you with SolarWinds, blah, 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 blah. Like, brace yourselves for that. You're probably already seeing it. Zscaler is actually someone that can help you with that. And it gets branded as zero trust, and we like to pick on that term. But and I hate to kind of dumb it down to, well, it puts a cheroot around all your processes. It essentially does that, but in a super smart way. And I'm kind of like, that's what we need today, right? Once we've done the basic blocking and tackling we've talked about in vulnerability management, I want to know what software is running on it, and I want to limit what it can do, because if someone gets in the update process, which is this not the first time that it's happened, right? It's probably the dozens and dozens of times we've seen this similar supply chain attack. I want to limit what that process can do. Zscaler can actually do that.
These kinds of breaches are really painful because, you see what happened and we all know what could have stopped it, but, and we also know the reason it wasn't there is because it's super painful and labor intensive to get to that point, to take each of your third party vendors and say, what are the least privileges? What's the least amount of access that it needs? So
but if you one of those times. If you look at Orion, that whole concept of least privilege is shot out of the water. I mean, just by the very nature of what that product did, it was basically hooked into almost everything in a lot of organizations and anything sensitive.
Yeah, I related that to the backup. Was it a backup exec used to have awesome vulnerabilities and exploits for it? And it was so great because in order to back up all your files, it needs access to all your files. So once you pop that process, I'm like,
how do you do
this is great.
Privilege on that? Yeah. And have you guys actually looked at the source code of like where they injected their malware into Orion?
I haven't.
It is amazing. Like you could show that to probably 10 security professionals, show it to them and say, hey, you got 45 seconds, find what's wrong here. Good luck. It was just that well done. And it's not like it's just, this is not an easy thing. And that's one of the things I like the fact that with Zscaler, what they're offering, I originally read this, Paul, and I cringed, right? I was like, oh God, this is going to be horrible. But all the things that they're offering to do to people for organizations are actually motherhood and apple pie stuff that actually can help. It's not like they're fixing the SolarWinds problem, because that's a much larger issue. But they're kind of saying, hey, here's the blocking and tackling that would kind of help detect this. And I think that that's pretty solid.
Also, John, I think, self-servingly, you and I have talked a lot about threat hunting, of course, and that's, to me, an integral part of this story. I think it really was a threat hunting kind of exercise that discovered it at FireEye, correct?
Yeah, I mean, they knew their offensive tools were hacked. And it was basically like, how the hell did this happen? And none of the standard ways actually stood up. So you're absolutely right. They had to go threat hunting and go deeper. But the command and control on this was amazing. It looked like it went back to AWS. And if you looked at the HTTP, it was actually mirroring the OIP. I think it's called OIP protocol. This is top shelf attacks all the way through. The Russians did a great job. So good job.
They did for sure. Anything else on SolarWinds? Do you want to weigh in?
Let's ship the Russians an award.
Right.
Top
I actually sent them Christmas cards this year.
There you go.
Said thank you. So for the past 2 weeks, BHIS has broken all of our sales records. So, and das vidanya.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Spasiba.
iBoss has raised $145 million. I actually had forgotten what iBoss did. I thought they were mobile security, but they're not. It's cloud security. Is that?
Yeah.
Well,
what do they do?
They've got several things. It was mostly network stuff, wasn't it? It was.
I thought it was
like SASE, CASB, proxies.
Yes.
That's
exactly right. SASE, CASB, proxy, and I think that brings their total almost to just shy of 200 million invested, 180 something.
Gotcha.
And they've been around for a long time. I think it's two brothers. And one of those has kind of flown under the radar. I think a lot of government contracts, that type of thing, like, they're never the first name that comes up, but they're always there lurking.
Yeah, I think they've been at it about 10 years or so, roughly, and growing really quickly, too. So their growth rate back when I was watching them a few years back was astronomical, so I can't imagine they've slowed down.
They're 18 years old.
There it is.
And the whole focus on like where they're at right now, they're in the perfect place. I mean, there's another article, you guys already talked about it, with zero trust. Yeah. Every time we mention that, I know there's people like, oh, it's a buzzword. No, it's not, because that's the way absolutely everything is going. So they're just absolutely in the right place. And I think that they didn't jump on this train like late. I think that they were one of the early adopters, kind of seeing the whole SASE model and where things were going.
What's your guys' assessment on that? I mean, I'm kind of excited about that, like I am about attack surface management, in terms of being able to manage remote access inside your cloud, outside your cloud, and slice and dice. It almost, in some models I've seen, like the DMZ is coming back because it's applicable now in the way that you implement this. SASE, that's it's again kind of a buzzword, right? But it also has to speak to, I don't want to funnel everything through one central point in the cloud to gain control over it. What SASE does, which I didn't realize, because again, I thought it was just a buzzword, is it spreads that load out so that you're not funneling through one point, but still gives you the control. I think in the times of working from home, this is one of the top technologies I think enterprises should be looking at, and probably largely are looking at. Wouldn't you guys agree?
I agree, but there's some fundamental problems, not just talking about IBOS or zero trust or anything. So I don't want to go into too much detail because we're working on some tools and we're talking with people. But if you look at the way authentication is going, right? If you look at like Office 365, if you look at Google, if you look at a lot of these different large cloud service providers for companies, I want you to think, how many times do you go to a website like DocuSign and it says, hey, you can authenticate with your Office 365 account or your Google account? The question I want everyone that's listening to this show to ask is a couple of questions. One, what level of permissions do these various third-party websites get access to whenever they actually, click the link and you authenticate with Office 365? So we'll look at DocuSign. If you click on Authenticate to Office 365 or Google with DocuSign, it gets access to your documents. Okay? So what does it actually get access to, number one? And the other question I want everybody that's looking at these kind of enterprise cloud integrations, the other question that's really important is, what permissions can those third-party websites gain to your cloud authentication provider?
Well, I mean, OAuth is perfect, so we don't have any issues there, right?
Right? Yeah, we're done. Yeah, you're right. Got me.
That is the dangerous part with OAuth, right? Is it's all about the implementation, and that's the purpose of OAuth, is to say that it's not logging in as me, but it has certain permissions that you allow it to access via an application. So DocuSign has certain, like we use Calendly, right? Calendly is an OAuth connection that has certain permissions to my account. But those, of course, can be abused, and not everyone implements OAuth correctly, certainly.
Well, and I would recommend anybody that does an enterprise is, number one, go and audit those permissions to what your users have already granted.
Right.
And number two, how do you actually audit that moving forward?
And that was Tyler's point, right? Like, no one looks at it.
no one's looking at them. And I mean, this really sounds very similar to me to what happened in the mobile security days. Applications were being installed on your phone. Nobody looked at perms. You pop up, you say, yep, I just want to fling pigs at birds. Let's go, right? Or birds at pigs. And I don't care if you take all of my information. That's fine. And I think it's a similar situation when you use the OAuth or the login, as people don't ever look at it and they just say, sure, go. And so that transitive risk occurs.
Yep.
Well,
and then
one of the
it also
challenging
creates
things,
this. So go ahead, Adrian.
I was going to say one of the challenging things is, if I give a third-party application access to my Gmail or my Office 365, say I'm using If This Then That or Zapier or something like that, I've got no visibility into what they're doing with some of that access. Like we had that, there was that one app that you could use to mass unsubscribe to stuff in your Gmail, and that's all they did. And I forget what the outcome was, but there's a lawsuit or something like that. It said they sold that entire all that access to Uber because Uber wanted to know right at the point when their customers were jumping over to Lyft, and they were using that to access people's Gmail inboxes to find out when that happened. And there's no way for you to know that. Only Google knows that, because
you've also got to ask, is that lawsuit going to be successful too? Because if you granted that access to that vendor, how can you actually sue them if they basically told you exactly what they were going to do with your data?
Right. Yeah, because who reads the EULA or who reads the screens that says this app needs access to this, right? You're like, well, yeah, I want to use it. Allow. No one. It's like a EULA. No one reads it.
Yeah, South Park is so prophetic. It's crazy.
Well, fantastic. I know we're a couple of minutes over, and we've got some more segments. I could go on a lot with you three, certainly. But thank you very much. That concludes the news, and stay tuned. Chris Brown from Imperva coming up next. You want to get the right things done for your security program. Sounds simple, but what are the right things for you? What does done mean? And how are you going to get there? Rapid7 realizes more than anyone how hard this can be. While Rapid7's Insight platform offers you industry-leading vulnerability management and detection and response solutions, their focus is on understanding where you are so that they can help you get where you're going. Visit securityweekly.com/Rapid7 to get started. Cybercriminals are opportunistically targeting industries that continue to operate full tilt during the coronavirus shutdowns, and their attacks have grown more sophisticated. Given this shifting landscape, taking the appropriate countermeasures becomes paramount. Mimecast Email Security 3.0 helps you evolve from a perimeter-based security strategy to one that is comprehensive and pervasive with cyber resiliency in mind. From the company that stops at nothing to block cyber threats, Mimecast is offering a fully featured 90-day web security service. Visit securityweekly.com/Mimecast to learn more. Data protection is a top priority with today's work-from-home workforce. However, current data loss prevention tools inadequately protect data in cloud or SaaS offerings from insider threats. Secure Circle automatically protects data as it leaves SaaS services such as GitHub, AWS, and Salesforce. The protection is transparent to users and works with any application to persistently protect data, even source code. Secure your data with Secure Circle's Zero Trust Data Protection. Begin your 30-day free trial by visiting securityweekly.com/Secure Circle. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. If you missed it, Security Weekly Unlocked, that is, you can now access all of the content on demand, whether you registered before the live event or not, by visiting securityweekly.com/unlocked, clicking either the button to register or the button to log in. This segment is sponsored by Imperva. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/Imperva. Joining us today from Imperva is Senior Director of Data Security, Chris Brown, where we'll be talking about, well, guess what? Data security. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
Chris, it's nice to have you on. It's interesting when Chris and I were talking, I believe it was yesterday, there was an acquisition that brought you over to Imperva. Was it JSonar? If I get that, did I get that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it focused on database security. And it was kind of funny. I was talking about some of my experiences with database security, and I'm like, I can see people falling into a whole bunch of traps, right? And now with the cloud, just being able to spin up databases so easily, I click that little checkbox and I go, oh yeah, encrypt my database. And people going, yeah, I'm done. Like I did database security. I'm good, right? There's more to it than that, though.
Yeah, no, it's the easy button, right? You just push that and away you go. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a lot more to it, particularly in terms of really understanding what's happening within these environments and having the appropriate level of visibility to understand this. And at JSonar, we had been focused on the database security space for quite some time and anticipated some of the cloud challenges quite a few years ago, and architected our solution to address this because it's unique in many regards. It's unique in the new diversity of databases, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, even how you go about collecting data to establish that level of oversight. And it's really been, I think, a shock for many organizations to realize that, oh, there's a whole new frontier here on the cloud side that I have to get my arms around, where it was already a pretty challenging frontier in the traditional models.
Yeah, I also feel like that database security doesn't get enough attention. And Chris actually asked me this. He flipped the interview around when we were prepping, right? And I was like, I think it kind of takes a back seat because your front of your application, whether you're in React or whatever your framework is, gets more attention because that's where you believe most of the attack surface is. To a certain extent, that might be true. That's where you're putting a lot of effort into making it usable. This is where your users are interacting with it, and we're trying to focus security around that. When you get kind of deeper into the application, all the way back to the database, as a developer, when I'm developing, for example, I'm like, yeah, the database is there. Like I can right click on it and access it, do what I need to do. All the rest of it's kind of like black magic. I don't want to touch the database. It kind of just works, right? I'm focusing on what's being presented to the user. Do you find that to be the case as well, Chris, when you talk to your clients? That's why it's not getting attention?
Absolutely the case. And it's why today there's still a very healthy percentage of organizations that haven't yet invested in database security. And I think it's in part because of this scenario that you described, which really doesn't quite solve it, because there's a particular set of security concerns at the application layer that are quite different from concerns at the database layer. And it's the old, why do bank robbers rob banks? It's the same model in the database world. It's the most effective target for large-scale extraction of data.
For sure. And the configuration is also, but I was doing a tutorial online, and it was just amazing. Like, if the database was a few revisions behind and it had this particular configuration and you could query it and figure out like where it stored files, for example, I could essentially become root on the system. I was like, wow, we talk a lot about preventing cross-site scripting and authentication attacks and things of that nature. But how often are we really digging into, in our meetings with developers, like how the database is secured? I feel like not as often as we should be.
Yeah, and I think it's one of a number of organizational challenges around database security, right? DBAs themselves are, for the most part, focused on performance optimization and applications. Certainly, there's some cycles allocated to the security component, but it's generally deferred to another team. And unfortunately, many of those teams that gather the responsibility for it don't have that depth of knowledge and expertise around the databases themselves. And so you're in a bit of a quandary as to, okay, well, where is all this going to be mapped, and how is it really going to be managed in a comprehensive manner? And part of the reason why I think cloud is so frightening in some regards is that, a traditional world was, I have 5 approved databases and I run on-prem. I go to the cloud, I have 25 databases now and 3 different cloud providers and the on-prem. So all of a sudden my problem space got a lot more complicated, making a challenging problem that much harder.
Yeah, it's an interesting progression, because I remember working for a larger enterprise back in the day, and if you need a database, you to your point, Chris, you had to go to a DBA, they'd have to spin it up, and that was your database. Now, fast forward to today, years ago in our own application, I came into work one day and I was like, what happened to the database container? Like, where did that go? And they're like, oh, we spun them up in RDS like yesterday. And there they are. And it was the developers that did that. Just spun it right up in the cloud. I was like, oh, our first cloud native service. I'm like, that's exciting, but also very terrifying now, because I don't have as much control, or at least I don't understand how to exercise as much control now, because now it's cloud native.
Yeah. And that same team, the cloud is very new to them. And I can tell you, in speaking with customers, there have been quite a few scenarios where applications have been stood up in the cloud, and then there's sort of this, oh crap, what about all these controls at the database layer? We need to get them in there, and migrating those controls can be challenging.
Yeah, migrating the tables and the data seems to be the easy part, right? Because cloud providers make that
easy part.
They want to make that easy, so you pay your monthly bill for your database hosting in their services. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think that sort of deludes folks relative to, wow, I thought this was going to be a lot harder. I moved my data in an afternoon.
Yep.
Like, yeah, but what about everything else?
Yep. Adrian, sorry, Tyler, did you have a comment?
Yeah. So, Chris, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this. But it seems to me that one of the other big changes we've seen is a lot of fragmentation in the different types and availability of databases. Like AWS has at least 4 or 5 different database types that you can choose from. Somebody will probably pop in and say, "No, it's a dozen now."
Yeah, it's at least. I think it's at least a dozen.
But we also have, I see applications now that use multiple different kinds of databases at the same time for different purposes. So you might have like an RDS for a main data store and then Redis for session management, for example. So are those additional challenges there too, where, maybe they're securing that main database, but Redis is sitting out there, on distributed across 7 different systems with no password?
Yeah, no, it's a huge problem because of the diversity, and also it's somewhat incompatible with how folks have done database monitoring in the past, right? The old model was install an agent, collect the traffic, and away you go. But now, to your point, you end up with 20 different databases, all the RDS databases. You don't have the ability to install an agent, so you require a different method for capturing that information. And you have to be able to normalize it to a single view of what's really happening across all these different systems. And that has proven to be quite challenging and something that we focused on quite a bit, because at the end of the day, if you look at your security controls and what your objectives are, how important is the fact that it's on RDS Oracle versus Redis or some other database platform? At that point, that's really just metadata. It's not key to how you're approaching this.
So you probably are seeing a pretty rapid growth then in your business, mostly because of the abstraction layer that's required on top of data stores, meaning we have 12 different data stores, right? And so you need an abstraction layer to look at all of those in a uniform different way. Couple that with, if we take the concept of the data store really truly becoming an application of its own with an API interface, right? You can almost treat the data store like an application. And if you do that, now you got to worry about the infrastructure layer, the host layer, assuming it's got a host. But in the case of cloud native, maybe some of this is abstracted away to the CSP. But it's not just about the data itself. That's a problem. But it's the infrastructure, the configuration, the support layers, everything building up. And then just a sprawling exponential growth of that.
Absolutely. Great point on multiple fronts. Yeah, we were and have been experiencing tremendous growth because of the realization that a new approach is required. And we think of it as separating the sensor layer from the intelligence layer. And there's going to be continued growth in the diversity of sensors, even beyond that scope of the databases and application. But even under that umbrella, think about it's not just the monitoring. You do have to understand the underlying vulnerabilities in the server itself, or find the databases to start with, right? It's still a problem today of where are all these databases that have sensitive data? How do I classify it? How do I manage who's accessing it? And historically, folks have really focused on the monitoring part, but I consider that one of 5 different pillars that for a comprehensive strategy need to be addressed. And some of those pillars may come from a variety of sources. You see a lot of focus on classification today. It's a big problem. And for that to be solved, it's going to be solved at different tiers within the organization, both a top-down and a bottoms-up approach.
Hell, I think you could take this all the way down even to just a basic discovery offering, just discovering what's out there, right? And to a point that you made in the previous segment, Paul, this is really a threat landscape problem when we start to talk about the explosion of data stores.
Yeah, it
and of
gets
course,
away from
on
you,
top
right?
of all this. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just saying, when I have a container and it has a database in it, I can manage that in my CI/CD pipeline. I can update it and all that stuff. Once it moved into RDS, I was like, how do I monitor it? How do I make sure it's on the latest version? And then now I've got multiple databases, because with a few clicks, I can create new ones. And then now they're in different VPCs. Maybe they're going across different regions. And now I'm like, how do I get a handle on it? I can't anymore without some type of tooling to help me with that.
No, you're absolutely right, and of course, I don't think Amazon's too motivated around solving that, because these databases get stood up, then they get forgotten.
Yeah, until you get the bill.
Away they go. So
been there.
Yeah, you get the bill, and maybe that's the clue. But and not only that, but we should also keep in mind that at the database layer, the volumes of transactions and interactions that you're seeing are very substantial. which means that the volume of data that you need to collect is very substantial. And that's been an underlying challenge for traditional approaches to this problem.
Yeah, turning on query
really
logs
motivated us.
I've turned on query logs in the past for a lot of different reasons, right? And then very quickly you're like, I need to turn that off because I can't
it falls
store.
Over.
Right? It falls over. There's performance issues. There's storage issues, especially if you're in the cloud. I'm storing that in the cloud. It gets messy with query logs.
Yeah, I mean, some of our clients are easily hundreds of terabytes of raw data that they store within our system to overcome those types of challenges. And it has a huge impact when you have the ability to do that easily and cost effectively, even to the degree that how do you shape your policy on what you're collecting from an oversight perspective, and how do you move beyond compliance and incorporate more security or even a broader set of use cases, forensics capability, or an operational / DBA capability where you can profile some of the behaviors that you're seeing if you have access to all of this data. And the challenge historically has been just that. Maybe you get a week's worth of data, a day's worth of data. It's not nearly enough data to fully leverage.
In profiling, you're also profiling in the product from a security perspective as well, right? Because it's always been one of my kind of dreams, basically. I haven't done it in our own application, but reading about it and studying it, I want to know that this application has, similar to the way we do that with HTTP requests on the front end, on the back end, I want to profile that in the database, and then I want to limit that to my application, right? And have those rules. Kind of like I don't want to say WAF, but I mean, I guess I just did, right? But for the back end, for your calls to your database. Yeah,
it's extending similar level of understanding and granular control, specifically at the database tier. And you're absolutely right. That's there's a large subsystem in our solution that is specifically focused on the analytical component and interpreting all of this raw data and being able to transform it into behavior analysis and apply machine learning, AI, all the usual buzzwords to this to fully characterize what's happening today and be able to identify unusual things as they occur in a number of different contexts. I think the scenario that you described at the application level is one, but what about the ability to contrast one DBA to another DBA to see if one is doing something unusual compared to the pool of DBAs over the last 6 months? These types of analysis become accessible when you have the data and you have the analytical wherewithal to sift through all that data.
Yeah, it's a much better approach. I think, Adrian, you might have been in on some of the meetings where we're like, well, we need a larger portion of random people on the internet to be able to access our application, whereas now it's just authenticated users. And I'm like, yeah, let's put that in a totally separate database because I don't trust the database security model to put it in the main database for the rest of the application. And in talking with Chris, I was like, wow, that's really a bad idea. I should probably get a better handle on my database security rather than increasing my attack surface and having another database, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And abstraction, is pretty important there too, and from an AppSec standpoint, parameterizing your requests using stored procedures instead of allowing the application to run ad hoc queries. There's all kinds of strategies there that can reduce, the likelihood that somebody can abuse the database from the application layer. But one of my big challenges doing incident response, and even before I got into security, and I was on the IT side, with visibility, was figuring out who was doing what. Because even back then, before everything was web-based, we'd have an application logging into the database, so everybody looked like, the prod DB account or whatever account the application logs in with. So tracing that back to one of 1,200 users then becomes kind of challenging if you don't have any monitoring, that can pull together that information and correlate it.
No, it's a great point, and one of the factors in the Imperva acquisition of JSonar, for those of you familiar with Imperva, they've had a very strong presence in the database or the data security domain for quite some time. Not only at the database layer, but also at the application layer, and then even out at the WAF layer. So now with a platform that's capable of capturing all this data, you can solve those types of problems because you have data from, again, different types of sensors that you can link together to have a much more deterministic view as to who this is that's traversing that path.
And there's also, when I've thought of database security, and Adrian, I think you bring up a great point. Sometimes we don't have as much control as we would like over application developers that are like, well, I'm going to use some kind of stored procedure or a layer to structure all of my queries, or I'm going to write them directly. But in front of the database, you can put something that is helping protect that from the application, right? That's part of the product suite, correct?
In terms of a firewall concept, database firewall.
Yeah, like what do you call that? I guess I'm struggling with terminology.
Yeah, database firewall is what I've always
database
heard it called. Yeah.
Yeah, and that capability has Imperva has offered that for a number of years now.
Mm-hmm.
There are some pros and cons around that approach. What I often see with customers is while the concept is very appealing, in practice there are reservations around it because now you're in the direct path between the application and the database.
Right.
And the implications
mm-hmm.
of that, both performance and risk for operational risk,
yep,
can be high. And so people are torn, yes or no, and it's still a pretty small percentage of customers that use that today.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like the one of the huge benefits, right? You talked about multiple terabytes of being able to collect and analyze those logs. That has much less operational risk and much less performance risk as you're monitoring those logs and giving people visibility. They can do operational and performance queries as well as looking at it from a security perspective.
Yeah, and plus in general, it's just much easier than traditional approaches. When you move to an agentless model, that's how you solve for the diversity of databases, the dynamics of the environment, the ability to quickly add new data stores into the model, and pull all of that together into that unified view. And database monitoring in general, it's been a challenge on the operational management side of the tools themselves in many scenarios, because as you start to collect more data, and you described this earlier, you start to put a strain on the system, or you're managing rules and policies, et cetera, and it just becomes very, very high overhead for achieving that. But when you shift the model to say, okay, I can collect more data, and I now have an opportunity to make a decision based on this larger volume of data post-collection, as opposed to at the point of collection, it gives you a lot more latitude.
Fantastic. Chris, thank you so much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
You bet. Thanks for the great discussion.
Folks that want to learn more can visit securityweekly.com/Imperva. Stay tuned. Coming up next, our friends from Trimarc will be here to discuss SolarWinds, among other things. Stay tuned. Today's networks are changing fast, and employees, devices, and infrastructures are more distributed than ever. Gigamon Threat Insight is a cloud-native, high-velocity network detection and response solution that's purpose-built to enable you to get in front of this transformation. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Gigamon. Uptycs has built a platform for SQL-powered security analytics. Extending the OS query agent, Uptycs collects, aggregates, and analyzes a wide range of system data and makes that available to solve multiple security challenges. Their solution provides visibility across Linux, macOS, Windows, containers, and cloud workloads. Their customers are using the Uptycs platform for fleet visibility, intrusion detection, investigation, and audit and compliance. Visit securityweekly.com/Uptycs and be one of the first to see how they've mapped over 500 behavioral rules to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Enterprises struggle to detect advanced attacks quickly and thoroughly as evolving threats continue to evade current security tools. Skillful threat detection starts with diverse, high-value security telemetry to run detections on. The Chronicle platform allows security teams to store and analyze petabytes of data in one place so that you can quickly apply powerful detection rules against all of your security data. Learn more about the Chronicle platform and the latest threat detection capabilities at securityweekly.com/Chronicle. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Learn how to conquer cloud complexity in our first Security Weekly webcast of 2021 on January 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can register at securityweekly.com/webcast. This one will feature myself, Adrian, and Mike Lloyd from Red Seal. Super excited about that. Talking with Mike is just... he's an epidemiologist in the 80s. I'm always just hammering him with questions that seemingly don't relate to cybersecurity, but then we're like, oh no, wait, that does kind of relate to what we do. So it's always interesting, certainly with Mike. Also, if you need to check out any of our previous webcasts, which you should, securityweekly.com/on-demand. I am excited to have with us for this segment to discuss some defensive team techniques as well as some of the, you might have heard SolarWinds stuff, Mr. Sean Metcalf and Tyler Robinson of Trimarc Security. Welcome, guys.
Hey, Paul.
Thanks,
it's
Paul.
good to be back. I haven't been on Enterprise Security Weekly, but I've been on Security Weekly a couple times. So
That's right.
It's good to be on here chatting with you again.
Absolutely. Of course, Tyler's a regular host on Paul's Security Weekly. And is this your first time on ESW?
It is. I am very excited to be on ESW. It's definitely one that I try and catch up on, but I have not been on this one.
It's awesome. It's good to have you. I want to just start with you folks, and just for our audience here on Enterprise Security Weekly, what is Trimarc Security, and what are you guys doing on a regular basis?
Sure. So Trimarc Security, I founded Trimarc about 5 years ago in order to fill in some gaps that I saw in the industry. We do red teaming, we do pen testing, these attack simulation sort of things, but there wasn't a really good security assessment on the market for Active Directory specifically. And pretty much every attack that happens at an enterprise today goes after Active Directory. So as a Microsoft certified master in Active Directory, I put together this security assessment to check all the different things that I could think of based on the security research that I've done and that of others to incorporate and really have this comprehensive review of the Active Directory security posture in an environment. We've since expanded into Azure Active Directory and Office 365 in order to assess those environments. And what we've seen in the news is that the attackers are going to go where the data is, where they can access and persist in the environment. And that often is in the Microsoft Cloud, specifically Azure Active Directory and the Microsoft Office 365 suite, as well as on-prem in Active Directory. So that's our core focus, but we've got some exciting things coming up in this new year.
It's awesome. And this is clearly your realm. I know enough to maybe be dangerous. I struggle to keep the terminology that Microsoft keeps changing. I'm like, wait, what's the difference between OneDrive and SharePoint? I'm confused. I'm really confused. It's Microsoft 365 now, not Office 3. They just keep changing names, making them even more confusing, right?
Yeah, we're going to continue calling it Microsoft Office 365 until such point that Microsoft doesn't have any more references to Office 365, because there's even license and subscription items that say Office 365. So I think to deconflict, we're just going to continue saying Microsoft Office 365, which just covers whatever that entity is at that time. But yeah, the name changes are annoying and they change frequently. I just can't imagine the level of effort it takes at Microsoft to update all the documentation when Windows Defender ATP changes to Defender for Endpoint. And then you've got to go and change all those references.
So when we talk about the SolarWinds attack, did that leverage some of Active Directory once they gained a foothold within the organizations? I would imagine that it would.
Absolutely. So attackers go after Active Directory because it is the identity and directory and authentication service for just about every business out there. I think something like 90 to 95% of organizations are running Active Directory. So it is a target because it's leveraged. It's leveraged because it's easy to implement, it's easy to manage. It's not so easy to secure based on people's configurations. I say that because out of the box, you're not going to have problems with Active Directory the way it's configured. It's when you start adding things like services, such as SolarWinds, and you add all these service accounts that are associated with those services, and there's rights that need to be configured for that. I did a tweet thread a few weeks ago when the SolarWinds really broke, and I went through the SolarWinds documentation to see what SolarWinds said you need to configure for each of the components of the SolarWinds product in order to monitor and manage those systems. Specifically in Active Directory, if you're going to install the agent on a domain controller, typically that's going to run a system. Anything that runs on system and a domain controller, well, you kind of own Active Directory. We have a big focus at Trimarc talking with customers, looking at agents and installed software on domain controllers to identify those as additional control planes. Anything that has the ability to install or run code on a domain controller could potentially own Active Directory. So that includes the accounts that manage those systems that have that connectivity into domain controllers. For example, with SQL, you have to set it up as DB owner, which is, again, got access on SQL. In the Microsoft Cloud, Office 365, it said configure it as global administrator, or you could probably delegate it out some other way, which means pretty much everyone's going to configure that with global admin rights. And that's God in the Office 365 space. See, I did it. Microsoft Office 365
right.
space.
I still do it as well.
And then even on the Azure side, it says, well, use contributor rights or reader. Contributor has the ability to make changes and even run PowerShell system on Azure VMs. So as you can see, it just starts expanding out into all these different systems. And if you're using SolarWinds to manage and monitor Active Directory, you're using it to manage and monitor, say, even VMware on-prem, your Azure VMs in the cloud, Office 365, the compromise of SolarWinds then has the ability to compromise all these other things. And that's not even to talk about, say, Microsoft ADFS, which is the federation component that Microsoft has available for companies that are using Microsoft platform, which they are usually, such as Active Directory, in order to federate their cloud infrastructure environment from Active Directory. So the user can just log in easily to that web server that's a cloud SaaS app and just get access to it without having to do any additional authentication. All that magic kind of happens in the background because of federation. Well, with these ADFS servers, we've seen at Trimarc that these aren't well secured. They're just treated as another server. So if an attacker has the ability to take over or control or have admin rights on that federation server, and I talked about this at DEF CON in 2017, which seems like forever ago, but if you're able to extract the signing certificate off of the ADFS or federation server, then you can impersonate anyone you want through that federation. So we heard of the golden ticket attack in Active Directory. This is very similar. It's been termed the golden SAML attack, where basically once you have that certificate, you then have the ability to create your own and forge your own certificates or tokens. Once you're able to forge your own tokens in order to connect to federated applications and systems. And at that point, you can say you're anyone. You can say you're the CEO. You can say that you're the admin.
Right. Now, Sean, I read something that the attackers that were behind the SolarWinds attack, that's what they were after, is that golden SAML ticket. Is that what you folks have found as well?
There have definitely been a number of attacks where the golden SAML type attack has been noted. The NSA has published some information about that. Microsoft has published it. It's one of those things that is easy for the attacker because those certificates are usually good for 2 years. So once you have a copy of that certificate or extracted that certificate information, which is not difficult, if you have admin rights to that system, you can then, again, forge whatever you want and impersonate anyone you want, just like the curb TDT on an Active Directory itself. So yeah, it is a big issue. Organizations have used Ping, Okta, other federation systems, third-party federation systems, If anyone could extract or access those certificates, which I'm sure they have pretty good controls around that, but it's the same sort of thing. So when you think about identity, and identity being the current risk or the current threat, if an attacker can go after that identity and take control of that identity, or at least the systems, if they can take control of the systems that control and manage that identity, then they can impersonate the people that the people of interest, the targets of interest. And if one of the ways that FireEye was alerted to the SolarWinds issue from the beginning, because the attacker added a new device to their MFA system. And that was the thing that triggered the whole investigation that FireEye did. So they were after that identity, and they recognized that in order to have continued access of that identity, they need to have a way to persist within the MFA configuration, even though they figured out a way to compromise the MFA system itself. The token, again, the signing certificate, the signing token for that MFA system is what they originally got. But then they wanted to think beyond that and persist. So as an attacker, you want to have several different methods of persistence, continue that access. But identity is the big thing these days, and that's what the attackers are going after, because identity equals access to data.
Tyler, sorry, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, from that standpoint, really, we've seen this type of attack from most of the APT groups, most of the criminal syndicates. Even ransomware targets things in the same manner. You have to have credentials in order to do something. There's certain activities that an attacker or an attack core components that have to happen. Execution being one of them. You have to have some sort of identity, which is where your credentials come in. So things like federation, things like multi-factor, all of those things play into the attack scheme, and there's certain activities you've got to be able to audit and monitor. And that's not just Active Directory on your premise. That's your, Azure, your federation. If you're using AWS, your IAM. All of those particular pieces fall into, from a whole, an enterprise maturity and security model that you have to follow in order to have some of that visibility. Now, that being said, the SolarWinds is kind of one of those attacks. We've been kind of having this discussion at Trimarc, where should SolarWinds and should the people that are compromised by them, was there things that they could do to avoid this? And the simple answer is really no. From a supply chain attack standpoint and from SolarWinds, this is a far-reaching piece of software in which you are trying to deploy it. You need certain functionality, and that functionality requires certain levels of permissions. Those permissions may be far-reaching. So the more functionality you have, the more permissions you need. And so really from a supply chain attack, these companies are inherently have to trust certain software. And that's kind of part of the problem that we're seeing with this particular attack. However, there's visibility points, and obviously visibility points that FireEye was able to see, but maybe SolarWinds was not. And I don't think SolarWinds was actually the first place or the only target from a vendor standpoint or a supply chain attack standpoint that was targeted. They just happened to be the easy one that was far-reaching and the one that happened to be detected. So there's some interesting caveats and correlation to that.
Are there things that we can do? And it's interesting how it's the delegation of duties is put forth in enterprises, right? You've got the security team. Then you've got in larger enterprises, you've got the team that's responsible for Active Directory and Azure. Likely, could be even separate teams, right? As we get larger and larger enterprises, what do we do? What's the advice, I guess, first from the security team? What should we be kind of conversations should we be having with our internal operations teams?
Yeah, I'll take this first, Tyler. I think the tough thing is that the fundamentals and the foundational items that we talk about all the time that always seem very boring or rote, the things like principal least privilege, separation of duties. As Tyler mentioned, the SolarWinds application or system is this thing that's far-reaching. It's monitoring and it's management. It has a lot of capability, and in order to leverage that capability, it needs rights across different systems, various levels of rights, often admin rights or close to admin rights. And the challenge with that is when you have this far-reaching, huge system with incredible scope and scale, with a lot of rights, compromise of that means compromise of pretty much everything, especially if it's configured and linked into Active Directory. Microsoft came up with this concept of the tiered model where you break out the different administration components with your most critical infrastructure being listed as a tier 0 component. And within that tier, you keep everything separate. So administration management of Active Directory stays in tier 0. Domain controllers are in tier 0. Federation servers like ADFS are in tier 0. So SolarWinds in that model would not have any rights to the domain controller unless it was a separate instance of SolarWinds within that. Well, that's a huge pain for operations to have to duplicate infrastructure. But really, it's a risk mitigation technique that limits the impact when something like this actually occurs. I hope that companies, even if they didn't have SolarWinds or that they weren't vulnerable to this issue, they are reevaluating all of their services and systems and the rights that they have across their systems to kind of tabletop what sort of impact it would have if any of these are compromised. This is not just a SolarWinds thing. This has happened before. It's going to happen again. There's going to be some sort of major impact or effect where someone has control of a system and the system is deployed broadly. Because of the access, because of the capability it has, it can do a lot of things. And as Tyler mentioned, that's what it was purchased for. I think we're going to have to start separating out monitoring and management a little bit better, so that way we can control what has read-only access for monitoring and what has admin capability from the management perspective, and then really start looking at these tiering models. But as I said, I think the important thing that companies can do today is to make sure that the correct things are being audited on their domain controllers, their federation servers, within their cloud environment, that those are being fed into a central logging and alerting system. And then in addition to that, they're also reviewing the rights that these service accounts have, often very high level rights like domain admin in Active Directory, as well as the rights within Azure AD. Those service accounts we find often are in global administrator. They have very powerful rights. And in the cloud, it's the Wild West. There's all these applications, many of which I've never heard of before. At least in the AD space, I'm familiar with a lot of them. So it's difficult to provide recommendations around that when vendors are available and provide some capability. The company does some due diligence, they get the vendor in. And as Tyler said, with SolarWinds, what would you do to stop this? It starts with principal least privilege. It starts with reviewing the rights and pushing back on vendors when you think that the rights are too extensive or too broad or too privileged.
Yeah, that really, that's the key right there, is preventing this becomes much less the exercise over what's your time to detection and time to remediation. That delta between your ability to detect and have the visibility and capability to detect, and then the delta for your teams to effectively respond to and remediate those alerts. That's where you start to see the more mature environments and their abilities and capabilities of their teams really start to shine, or you start to see the gaps. And that's often where we see pen tests and different assessments. That's where we see some of the value that is provided, but there's still a lot of gaps there, and there's still a lot left to be had from an enterprise wanting. I think one of the other big critical areas that we really have to start focusing on is outside of the technology realm. We need to get the buy-in and collaboration and cooperation of each of these asset owners from the top down. We have to have that support, and we have to have things such as the Active Directory team working in close conjunction with the server team or the deployment team. Help desk needs to understand the Active Directory infrastructure and the rights that they hold and what they're actually capable of doing, and make sure that those are properly in align with the security team. And so all of those communication channels and collaboration between each of the teams becomes much more effective from a business standpoint. Those teams need to also understand the business. If we don't understand the business, like Sean said, some of the recommendations or remediations may affect operations such that it's not a good business risk decision. At the end of the day, we are capitalists. The company is in it to make money. And if we hinder that via security, that needs to be well evaluated and understood so that we know that what we're doing is appropriate and fits the business model and makes sense from a business standpoint. If you're going to spend $100,000 for something that is going to provide you, $30,000 of mitigation, that doesn't make sense from a business standpoint. Yeah. So we really do have to understand the business.
You guys live this every day, right? And I've broken it down, I think earlier this week on Business Security Weekly, that controls introduce friction, right? And that's,
yes.
And I'm sure you've seen so many organizations, right? You walk in, you're like, wow, you guys have everything configured perfectly. No, that usually
communication can grease that friction. Yeah. You really do need that buy-in and that good collaboration and relationship. Honestly, like business everyday business is relationship, and that even if you're in the technical field and you deal with computers all day, if you're not out there building those relationships and making sure that you have buy-in and help, and that's give and take from both an empathy and a sympathy standpoint, and help the teams through communication in the other departments, you're not going to effectively run a good program and a smooth running business.
Yeah, and Tyler hit on it right there. The empathy and sympathy. The environments that we've seen that are secured the best are the ones where operations doesn't just do operations. They look at things from a security perspective too. They may even have some security roles within operations. And security and operations works very closely together. In the security team, they have some people that understand operations. You have to have that understanding of both to really be effective in getting things done. Too often, security throws something over the fence and says, okay, disable NTLM. And operations is like, we can't do that. That's just not possible. In any kind of environment or most environments. So they start to go, all right, well, these recommendations just aren't feasible. We can't implement them because there's just not anything we can do. So we'll just put it on the shelf and deal with it later. And unfortunately,
but even
the things
worse,
that
Sean,
really should be done often get grouped into that as well. So it does take that empathy of what operations is dealing with. They're fighting fires all the time. I mean, when I was an AD admin, I wasn't thinking about all these different security components or even really knew about them because it's a full-time job keeping up to it. That's what we do at Trimarc.
Right. And I think even worse, Sean, is,
it's complicated to manage AD these days.
You put a control in place, let's say it's NTLM, right? And they implement it, but then it introduces friction and then they back it out. And then what's the communication path back? So oftentimes I've found that communication path gets broken and it doesn't come back up until there's an assessment or some kind of pen test. And the security team's like, wait a minute, we agreed that this was going to be turned off, this control was going to be in place to mitigate it, but it's not. That's the difficult thing to me.
Right. Yeah, and some of the environments I've seen that have had, say, more security challenges are the ones where users could push back on that friction and say, look, these security controls are stopping me or slowing me down from doing my business or my work. And then the business people said, all right, well, let's remove that friction. Let's remove those controls. And so everything was open and it was a very bad situation. So there's definitely got to be a balance. And so understanding the business, as Tyler mentioned, and understanding what operations is doing and what they need to do to get their job done, especially when operations and security report to different management chains. So they have different priorities, different budgeting, different things they need to get done. And the security items often aren't part of that unless the security and operations works very well together and have that good relationship, because it starts with a relationship, like Tyler said. Some of the best environments I've seen have been where the head person or the blue team lead and the red team lead or the security lead and the operations team lead, they meet up like once a month at least and know each other well by a first name basis and maybe have gotten lunch together before and talk about the challenges they have, the things that they want to do, because it's got to be a collaborative thing.
Adrian? So
question for you, Sean, and I think you've answered part of it, but the next SolarWinds, that there's a lot of software that most companies have to evaluate. Is the best place to start looking at those service accounts and looking at what access they have? What's the best place to find the riskiest stuff, and prioritize that work of finding those applications and just finding a starting point to prevent whoever the next target is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it starts with categorizing systems, as painful as that sounds, but even from a basic level. What's critical? What's the most important things we have? We have Active Directory. Okay, so domain controllers are critical. We have data stored in SQL servers and other database servers. So we're going to label that critical. This data is very important. If it gets leaked or exposed, then that's bad. And then go from there. Then you're looking at the accounts, the administrative accounts, accounts with access, groups that access to those systems, as well as service accounts. Within Trimarc, we have an internal knowledge base of known named service accounts, so the different types of names that we've seen for specific products. So whenever we do an assessment, we identify that these service accounts that have similar names or close to that link to this product, and we have an idea of what sort of rights that product typically requires. The other thing that we've seen is that a product was installed 15, maybe 20 years ago. Well, the security model of that product 15 years ago could be very different than it was 5 years ago. So I would say start with identifying those service accounts and that inventory of services, systems, So starting with Active Directory, looking at which ones are highly privileged, so they're in administrators or domain admins or one of the privileged groups within there, and identify what is the system associated with that. Reach out to your vendor and say, hey, is there an update? Is there a way that we can do this without domain admin? We actually have about 6 or 7 case studies where we've identified how to reduce the rights from domain admin down to much less than that. By using delegation in order to provide access that is required without using domain admin or administrators. Because very often the vendor says that's what they need, but then a few years down the road, that changes. We were actually quite happy we were able to get a major vendor to change their documentation from saying they needed domain admin rights to actually just user rights and the ability to join a computer to the domain.
They didn't actually check.
It starts with that
just being
inventory
lazy, right?
of the systems, the service accounts associated with them, what rights they have, which can be complicated because not everything's in AD. So in that SQL server, you could go ahead and add a bunch of groups within AD to have different rights within SQL. So you have to go to SQL, you have to go to those applications to check. That's why it's important to do that categorization and then figuring out what rights they have and then tracking down, okay, what are the rights that they need today versus maybe what they needed before.
And some of that really does come down to communication again, right? Like from the business standpoint, talk to your business leaders, talk to the executives and the asset owners. What is the sensitive things in our environment? What do we make money on? And what would be the fatal blow if this was compromised? Maybe that's PII, maybe that's not. Maybe that's your IP or intellectual property. So not just taking your identity and the services and things that run on the identity control, which is in AD the domain controllers, but looking at where the data actually lives and categorizing that data in those servers that manage things like Azure Connect or the databases that handle all of your sensitive information. So making sure you're having those communications and really do understand not just what you think the business is or what is sensitive in the business, but what actually makes the business important and makes us money.
Yeah, and the toughest thing with the SolarWinds issue is that the company did their vetting. Like these organizations that had SolarWinds, they did their vetting. Who uses SolarWinds? They went to the website, saw all these companies that use it.
Right.
They said, these are the capabilities we want to use. They installed it. They kept it up to date. They did all the things that they were supposed to. Let's say that they even installed it per the vendor documentation. So at that point, it's an issue of how do we best mitigate if this sort of thing happens again? I was speaking with an executive at a Fortune 500 in the past few weeks about this, and they just didn't have a vulnerable version of SolarWinds configured. They got lucky because it didn't update. So, you have the situation where, okay, you had a vulnerable version, but you weren't on the target list, so therefore the kill bit was applied, or you didn't have a vulnerable version and it didn't happen anyway. So, going through this process, I think the contracting process also needs to go hand in hand with the system owners themselves, having a good understanding of what are these products that are being purchased that are supposed to do all these capabilities, and what is the risk of doing that? The risk assessment beyond just, okay, what does SolarWinds have as far as their third-party, vendor analysis? How do they do code updates, things like that? But really, what are the rights that are required, and what is the risk to our organization if we deploy it with everything turned on and the rights deployed as per the documentation?
That's that security mindset. Like, go ahead.
And then how do you do that in a POC when you're planning on buying a product? I mean, that's the really tough thing I see. Like a lot of people don't even have test environments for their POCs, and a POC is something they don't have time for anyway because they're putting out fires. So, I mean, that gets challenging to try and figure that out before you buy a product.
Right. And I would say the number one question I ask is, does this need admin rights? And how can we do it without it having admin rights? This situation of agent versus agentless that we've been going back and forth for years. I've been in the industry for like 20 years now, and it seems like we keep bouncing between agent and agentless. You get an agent installed on the computer, then you end up with 20 agents, right? But agentless means that there's potential credentials being dropped on the system.
Yep.
I've seen inventory systems, massive inventory systems that scan the whole environment, gather information from those systems to pull it into a central inventory, database. And these inventory systems have tremendous rights. They have admin rights on everything. So it's not just a SolarWinds issue. This is a systemic issue that we have because we need these products that are able to have capability across a lot of different types of devices. And very often they need admin rights to do the thing that they were purchased or acquired to do. So at that point, we need to look at credential management of those service accounts. So first of all, identifying that those are the actual rights that are required for that service account, but then how can we manage that? So this is somewhere where actually an enterprise password vault might make sense, because the credential could be used and then the credential could be changed immediately after it was used. So that way, if it was exposed, then there's some sort of mitigation there. Or even a situation where it doesn't have full-time privileges, it gets the privileges to do certain things, and then it gets pulled back. But ideally, and the thing that we recommend, especially with scanning accounts, vulnerability scanning accounts, which typically are in domain admins, is to break those out. Have one service account for your workstations, have one for servers, have a different one for domain controllers. That just mitigates if that credential is stolen or lost, or if the system blips and it's left behind on a computer somewhere. That doesn't solve the core problem of this system that we're using to scan everything has rights to everything. And that's going to be a problem that is a hard problem. It absolutely is a hard problem to solve. But I would say starting with the categorization, moving to the inventory of the service accounts and what rights they have, and then looking to see if there's a way to mitigate how long that system has those rights, or even credential management of the service accounts associated with it can be very helpful. And then the monitoring, obviously, the auditing and tracking of what are these systems doing.
Sound advice.
This is just the beginning, right? Like SolarWinds is the tip of the iceberg. There were companies, like government was obviously a critical target and was heavily influenced and infiltrated via this. But there were also technology companies that we rely on for things like drivers, for things like agents. I mean, VMware, NVIDIA, Intel, Cisco. There was a list of very large companies. So this may have just been the volley attack, where we do have to start getting our house in order, making sure that those other tech companies, those other agents, the other providers that we rely on and trust in our environment, those are now well secured, because there may be another round of this and it may be more severe. So really ensuring that you're doing the right thing, figuring out what the root cause is, which is your identity and the permissions and privileges that you're allowing vendors and supply chains to access your environment. That's a risk and a business risk that needs to be mitigated.
Right. And there are some free tools to check these things. So at Trimarc, we published at trimarcsecurity.com, we published actually hub.trimarcsecurity.com. We published over the summer a free PowerShell script that can be used to gather some information. We have a blog post that's associated with that, where it breaks down, here's the things that you should look at. Here are the recommendations to configure these. Part of that is looking at the administrators, the Active Directory administrators in the environment. CrowdStrike released a tool over the past couple weeks called CRT. I forget what the actual acronym stands for, but it helps you scan your Azure AD and Office 365 environment for some of the things that could be potential issues. CISA.gov, the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, released a tool they called Sparrow, which can be used against Azure AD Office 365 in order to check application permissions, and it also scans the unified log for potential issues or permissions or configurations, or even attack activity in the environment. So I'd highly recommend looking at those, especially for the cloud environment, and then also checking your AD environment for those low-hanging fruit, those things that can be resolved fairly quickly, as well as some of the things that may take a little bit more time.
Oh, that's awesome. Great advice. Sean and Tyler, thank you so much for appearing on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. Adrian and Tyler, thank you. Awesome show. Glad to have everyone. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.